This is a knitting loom, and knitting looms are a tool for knitting where you wrap yarn around these pegs and then you use a hook to then hook the loops over the pegs to form stitches. So this is a device that's pretty easy for beginners to use, and you can make small items like hats and scarves. But generally as a beginner, you're probably just going to create items that are just one color of yarn or just one type of stitch. So this is a hat that's knit on a loom using a technique called fair isle knitting, and that introduces multiple yarns to create the patterns. And this technique, it's a bit more advanced and could be challenging to beginners because you have to read a pattern, memorize the pattern, go back to the loom, remember which stitches or which colors for which pegs. So this entire process kind of slows down the knitting process and introduces a lot of opportunities for mistakes. And those are some of the issues that I found when I knit my first Fair Isle hat on a loom. And I want to talk a little bit more about that process that I went through trying to knit this hat for the first time. So knitting my first hat, I didn't want to necessarily design a pattern. I just wanted to pick a pattern and then knit it. So I first looked through patterns through a book that came with my knitting machine. But it was kind of hard to visualize how these patterns would look repeated on a loom. On the loom on the finished hat. So I actually copied and pasted the pattern into Excel to visualize it. And then this ended up being the process that I used to knit as well. So I highlighted each row to remember what the pattern was as I went row by row, which this pattern, it's a little bit easier. You can see it's just 4, 4, 3, 1, 1, 3. But I had tried to knit this pattern right here, which is a bit more complicated and hard to memorize. So thinking of all these issues, I developed eLoominate, which goals are to make this technique more accessible to beginners. And one of the reasons that I kind of identified was one of the issues was the pattern and the loom not being in the same space. So this digitally augmented device then incorporates the pattern into the loom. So you use the loom just as you would a traditional loom, that you wrap the yarn around the pegs. So here I wrapped the orange yarn around all of the orange pegs and then went back through to wrap the blue yarn around the blue. And then after completing an entire cycle, you press the button to advance to the next row and you repeat the process. And just like before with the other loom, after a few rows, you start to use the hook to hook those loops over the pegs and form the stitches of your knit fabric. And then after some time, the fabric, those loop stitches form on the inside of the loom. So with eLoominate, there's also a software component of it where you can design and download patterns onto the loom. So there, I just hit the suggestion button that generates a new pattern and then puts it onto the loom. So the design of this tool, first, it was the design of the physical tool preceded the design of the software. So when designing the loom, the first decision was whether to design a custom loom that would be 3D printed or to see if there was the possibility of making a mold of an existing loom. So the factors that went into if an existing loom could be used was the number of pegs. So if you have the pattern and then you want it to evenly repeat around the entire loom, the number of pegs around the loom needs to be highly divisible. So in my research, there were actually a lot of looms that had a prime number of pegs, which is not ideal, but this loom had 48 pegs, which could be divided by 24, 16, 12, 8, 6, etc. So it's very ideal. And then even better was that the spacing in between the pegs was only 5/8 of an inch, which is almost exact to 60 LEDs per meter. So I was able to use existing LED strips very easily with that. So the mold making process was went through several iterations. So you can see this first mold that I made. It was using a silicone putty, and it was easy to work with, but the mold ended up having a lot of bubbles and cracks in it, and the resulting loom was too rough to use. The yarn would get caught in it. So then I switched over to a pourable liquid silicone, and that worked out really well. So the looms are cast out of resin. And then this is kind of the schematic for what's all inside the loom or attached to it. So the goal for this was to create this loom that was embedded with electronics without adding extra bulkiness. So the microcontroller chosen was an Arduino Nano for its small size. And there are smaller microcontrollers, but the smaller ones had then smaller amount of memory. And it was important to be able to hold that entire pattern in the loom because it takes 6 to 8 hours to knit a hat. So you may want to turn the loom off and turn it on at a later time. And then there are 2 LED strips, one that goes inside, one that is corresponding to the 2 buttons. And the physical embedding of the electronics is definitely going through iterations. So at first it was kind of all these pieces haphazardly soldered together, and then moving towards the direction of having a custom printed circuit board where all the components can be nice and neat. So the initial idea was not to have a software component. You would just program the pattern directly on the machine, or sorry, on the loom. So you can see here, what you would do is you would tell eLoominate how many stitches wide your pattern would be, and then how many rows tall. And then after that, you just key in the pattern. So this worked very well for situations that maybe you're just reading a pattern, like from that pattern book that I showed before. But this doesn't give really any opportunities for someone to design their own patterns. So it was important to then have a software casual creator to accompany this physical casual creator. So then that led to the development of the eLoominate software, which the software runs in the browser, uses HTML, CSS, the P5.js library for drawing in the canvas, as well as the P5 serial port library to connect to the loom. So designing this software, it's focused just on the constraints within the loom. So having the pattern be only 48 stitches wide, and then only being able to have that number of stitches be a factor of that, and then only constraining it to 2 colors. There are existing knitting software out there, but the one that I have designed in it was like $500 and has way more functionality than needed. And then also it wouldn't be able to download to eLoominate. So that's the reason for the custom software. So just kind of walking you through it, there's 3 steps. First, you connect your loom, and then you're able to design your own pattern. So here I'm just designing or drawing directly into the canvas. And you can switch between viewing the entire pattern as a grid, or just the individual motif, or even view it in 3 dimensions to kind of see how it would look on a hat. And then here I'm clicking the button that generates a random pattern in random colors. And you can even modify those patterns too. So here I'm taking one of those pre-made patterns and continuing to draw it and change the dimensions to transform it from that previous pattern into something new and unique. And then afterwards, you can hit the Send to eLoominate button, and it downloads to the loom. So once you download it to the loom, as you click through, you're able to see your progress row by row. And with eLoominate, primarily the focus is on using the colors to designate which color of yarn to use, But in this case, I am using the two different colors to designate if I'm going to use a purl stitch or a knit stitch, which is used to create the ribbing or like the stretchy headband part of a hat. And interesting, in my own user study, or just me testing it myself, this was not useful. I was still making tons of mistakes and not remembering which one was purl and which one was knit. But when these two were used to designate what color of yarn, I didn't make any mistakes. So that was pretty interesting. And I'd be curious to see what happens in actual user studies. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of the physical loom, reconsidering using resin as a material, because the resin, when it gets warm, when you are holding the loom and the lights are on, it gets a little bit soft. So I'm not sure if that's because the resin just hasn't cured enough or if the resin will never cure properly. So I might look into other materials, also in the process of streamlining that form, because right now it's completely wrapped in electrical tape. So I'm thinking of a better way to enclose that Arduino with maybe some 3D printed parts. And then also another direction that we're thinking about is having kind of a modular loom system to not just have the one size of hat that you can make. And then with the software, a lot of work needs to get done in terms of how to, I guess, better support the generation of new and interesting patterns, thinking about the principles of casual creator softwares. So here is another process or example of me taking one of the pre-made patterns and turning it into a different pattern, which right now, there's only, I think, 6 patterns that are coming up in the generation. And there's actually a lot more unique color combinations, which in real life, the colors are actually a bit more limited than the patterns, because you're just stuck with whatever is available in the store. So that was kind of interesting in terms of the difference between the two. So in conclusion, what eLoominate does is it takes a existing physical casual creator, the knitting loom, and then it increases the amount of beginner-friendly designs by making that fair isle technique easier. And then in that process of having a physical casual creator, it then was revealed that it would benefit by having a software casual creator, and we're still in the process of discovering what that software should look like and how it would better appeal to novice users. And if anyone has any questions, I am happy to take them now. I have a video, and also the software is on my website at jordangraves.com/eLoominate.